real quick, if you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. Also, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Campfire Cult Pod for free. It'll really help us reach listeners just like you. If you want to become a Patreon cult member to get extended episodes and other full Patreon-only episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/campfirecultpod for only $5 a month. And finally, if you don't mind, please share, rate, and review wherever possible. Welcome, dear listener, to the Campfire Cult Podcast. From a camper van deep in the haunted woods, I bring you first-hand accounts of chilling encounters with the paranormal. Step into the night and take a peek into the realm where reality and the supernatural collide. My name is Jazz, and I'll be your host. Welcome back, campers. Tonight, we dare to tread deep into the forest and explore the legend that has haunted the Midwest for decades, the enigmatic Dogman. First up, as a child, a woman saw two towering coyote-like figures walking silently on hind legs outside of her bedroom window.
I have recently learned what skinwalkers are, and it completely made sense of an event that happened to me as a child that I had previously completely blocked out of my brain. I don't believe I was targeted in this scenario, but I do know that this absolutely happened. I was definitely not dreaming. I was about 11 years old, visiting my mom's extended family in California with my parents and siblings. I had been there before, and I always slept alone on an air mattress in the living room, which had a greenhouse-like glass-paned wall to the front of the house, facing the street. My air mattress was tucked behind a couch, so it's not like anyone could look inside and see me. The house was also about 75 to 100 feet back from the road, with a large gate in the front, so I didn't feel exposed at all in that front room. It was a usual summer evening, and everyone settled into bed. I remember that I used to like to stay up late playing games on my Nintendo DS or iPod, especially on vacation. I had been on my iPod getting a little sleepy when I started to hear strange rustling noises coming from outside. I sat up and peered outside, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The road outside was dimly lit by a streetlight, so any animals I would have seen. I figured it was probably an animal in a bush somewhere, so I put my iPod down and tried to go to sleep, though my eyes were still pinned to the window out of curiosity. A few quiet minutes pass, and I convinced myself that it was nothing. The minute I laid back down, something across the street caught my eye and I darted back up. Completely silently, I saw what appeared to be two coyote-like figures, only they were mainly walking on their hind legs, which looked much bigger than their front ones. They appeared to be 6 or 7 feet tall. There was absolutely no noise at all. I could not believe what I was seeing. One of them turned to look towards me, so I ducked my head down behind the couch. After a few moments, I slowly peeked again. They continued walking the same direction until I couldn't see them anymore, so I finally went to bed. At the time, I don't think I was super freaked out. I figured it must have been some sort of animal. I never asked anyone about it, though, and only as an adult did I realize that there are no such animals like the ones I saw. I know coyotes exist and are abundant in California, but they do not walk on their hind legs, and they're certainly not 7 feet tall.
Next, a seasoned outdoorsman shares a chilling encounter in the rural South with a supernatural creature.
Just so that you have an idea of my background, knowledge, and experience, I grew up all over the rural southern United States, from the Appalachian Mountains to the swamps, backwoods, and bayous of the Deep South, where I spent most of my free time deep in the woods, up into my early 20s. I spent a lot of my time hiking, camping, hunting, and fishing, and have always felt at home and at peace miles from nowhere. The more remote, the better. I'm well educated. I have a degree in a field of science and have seen various types of wildlife like coyotes, wolves, panthers, and bears in the wild. When I was about 17, my family moved to the Florida Panhandle. The woods in that area and around my house went on for many, many miles and are only interrupted by the occasional creek, river, country road, or farm. There really are many miles of woods that see very little traffic out there. I was told by the locals that the area around my house had special significance to the Native Americans, and on a few occasions people alluded to things being odd in that area, but no one ever told me anything specific. If anything, the few who seemed to know anything got weird and quiet if I pressed them about why they made remarks about the woods, so I dismissed it and lived my outdoor life as I normally would. On one occasion, some friends came over to our property, and we decided to go camping. We went down to one of the creek bottoms a mile behind the house and hung out for a while, but after remembering all of the water moccasins that hung out down there, I decided against camping out there out of concern that I might get bitten by a snake in the dark. There were a lot of cottonmouths down there, and they became more active at night. So around dusk, I and another kid went back to the house, and the other two were going to camp out for the night. Probably an hour after dark, the other two showed up looking shaken. They said that they were going to sleep inside too. They seemed spooked, but when I asked them if something was wrong, they got weird and clammed up. The next day, we went back to the creek bottom to goof around and do teenager stuff. One of my friends had brought his rifle, which he seemed eager to try out. It was one of those old Chinese SKSs. We were messing around the campsite they had abandoned the night before, when one of them commented about seeing something that looked like the invisible thing from the movie Predator. I thought they were being silly, but they were insistent, so we looked around and saw nothing. A little while later, the friend with the rifle fired a shot up into the trees, which was immediately followed by a huge splash in the creek. When I looked at the creek, I saw large waves from the impact, like someone had thrown something really big into it with a lot of force. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something brown and blurry in the creek, but before my eyes could even focus on it, nothing was there to be seen. Yet there were the waves still moving. It was weird. I was surprised. I didn't know that he had intended to shoot at anything and had been looking the other way. My other friends didn't seem to know what had just happened either. We asked him what just happened, and he said, "I saw a large hairy thing up in that large limb of the tree and shot it." I know that was absolutely irresponsible of him. I asked him what he just shot. Was it a raccoon or something? "No," he said. "It looked like something out of a zoo. Kind of like a big monkey or something, but it had a face, and it was looking at me. I must have hit it because it fell into the creek." All of this happened in less than a minute, and we ran the 25 feet over to the creek where we all had heard the splash. There was still a slight disturbance in the water, but we never saw anything. When I questioned the friend, he reiterated that he saw a hairy thing that reminded him of something similar to a baboon looking at him from on top of a large limb of the tree. But he repeated, "It had a face, and it was looking at me." I asked him, "What do you mean it had a face?" "Like a human face." He said, "No, it wasn't human, but it didn't look like any animal's face that I've ever seen. It didn't look like a monkey's face either. It was different." We searched the banks and looked around, but didn't find anything. We even walked down the creek a good ways to see if he had killed something and it had floated away. We never found anything. No blood, no tracks, no fur. But whatever had happened, he had irresponsibly shot at something, and even if out of surprise, it had fallen into the creek, but we never found any sign of it. It was shortly after this that things started feeling weird, a little eerie, and we called it a day. I never knew what to think of that event, and I think I had written it off as something that either just didn't make sense or some kind of crazy, very successful prank. I even asked the other two guys if they were screwing with me, and they swore that they hadn't done anything. One of them did see him fire the rifle, but didn't know what he was shooting at. He said he saw something fall in his peripheral vision, but when he looked in the creek, there wasn't anything there. life continued on as normal, and I spent a lot of my free time hiking, exploring, and looking for fishing holes off of that small creek. At some point after this, I started having weird experiences in the woods periodically. Sometimes, usually late in the day or at dusk, I would get the feeling that I was being watched. The feeling wasn't there most of the time. It would just happen on occasion. I started noticing that sometimes in the evening, I would hear strange animal noises from the surrounding woods. A few times it sounded like a blood-curdling scream. Once it sounded like a roar, and a few times it sounded like some type of odd bird-like cry, similar to a peacock. Being familiar with animals, I always tried to deduce what animal had made the various noises. I concluded that the screams must be a panther, that the roar must have been a bear, but the peacock noises made no sense. There were 3 neighbors within the next 1.5 miles on that isolated road, and none of them had peacocks. Then late one evening, I heard a more intimidating scream than before. It just sounded bizarre and caused me a sense of fear and dread. The scream sounded like a woman being murdered. I don't know how else to describe it. It was high-pitch, shrill, and loud, but it seemed too loud and lasted too long to be a human. I figured it must have been a panther, but it didn't feel right and sent chills down my spine. It was during the last bit of twilight, before total darkness, and I hurried my butt back to my house. Sometime after that, the occasional sense of being watched and followed began to feel stronger and more malevolent. On a couple of occasions after that, when I was out in the woods, I felt that I was not just being watched, I was being hunted, and that my life was in danger. I never saw or heard anything. The woods were always silent when this happened, and I always quickly made my way home, but made a point to walk as I felt running might trigger a predator like a panther to chase me if that's what it was. Whatever it was, I felt like I was in imminent danger of death. It was a consuming feeling, like nothing that I've ever felt. One day during this time, my little brother and his friends came running excitedly up to me and told me that 2 of them had seen a bear. Being that this area had been heavily hunted for many years, and there were not supposed to be any bears anywhere near this part of Florida, I asked them what they saw. They said that they had turned around and seen the hind end of something on all 4s, walking into the edge of the forest. They only saw the very end of the creature, and could only see the upper part of the back legs, and its back right above the legs. They said it was brown, it had hair, and that it was much bigger than a dog, so it must have been a bear. Again, there are no bears known to exist anywhere near there. At some point after this, I was out hiking again one day, and had made a point to bring my shotgun loaded with number 4 shot, which was the largest pellets that I had. I had begun carrying it, when hiking as a precaution to whatever was out there, I was still leaning towards it being a panther. I didn't know what else it could be that would stalk a human and go undetected. I had noticed that the strange feelings and various strange sounds seemed to happen around dusk or at night, so I had started making a point to get back home well before dark. This time I had stayed out too late. Dusk was beginning as I was making my way home when I felt it again. Something was watching me. No. It felt like something was after me. The level of fear and the senses that this thing triggered were completely different from anything that I had ever felt. I knew I was being stalked, but I couldn't see or hear anything as I made my way home. Whatever the thing was, it seemed to move with me as I had walked hundreds of yards, but the feeling had only grown stronger. I felt like my life was in peril, like something was about to lunge out and kill me. Every hair on my body seemed to be standing up, and I felt certain that whatever it was, that shotgun wasn't going to stop it. Despite the terror I was feeling, I forced myself to stop and scan the woods, looking at both the ground and the trees, thinking that I might see a panther nearby readying itself to pounce on me. There was nothing that I could see or hear. Everything was deathly quiet. It was about this time that I first remember an inner voice saying something like, "Don't stop. Go. Quick. Don't run." I started praying as I walked to the house. In every fiber of my being, I felt a sense of malice and intent. Whatever this was, it wanted to kill me. I felt sheer terror, sheer dread, in a way I had never felt in my now 17 years. Remember, I grew up in very rural areas full of remote, isolated spots. Those places were where I felt most at peace. Animals didn't scare me, but whatever this was did. That feeling was terrifying and consuming. It was all that I could do to walk home, clutching my useless shotgun, praying to God to protect me. And he did. Usually when I got within 200 to 300 yards of my house, the feeling would subside. This time, the feeling followed me right up to about 50 yards from my home. I continued praying, and as I reached it, the feeling eased off, but I felt like whatever it was nearby watching. From that day on, I started occasionally feeling a malevolent presence emanating from the nearby woods. Sometimes it didn't feel safe in my own yard at night. I remember one time when I walked into the backyard and heard the scream again. It sounded like a woman screaming in terror, only extremely loud, and it lasted too long to be a human, and then it transitioned to something like a baby crying. But the crying changed to become distorted and twisted, and it just felt and sounded like something that was wicked, was trying to frighten me. From that point on, I avoided the woods, especially when alone or in the evenings. I turned to partying and tried to push the events from my mind. A year or two had passed without incident, and I had gotten too relaxed. Sometimes I get the occasional itch to go for a stroll at night. The moon was mostly full. The sky was clear with lots of stars. It was a bright, beautiful early autumn night. I still had enough apprehension to stay out of the fields and woods, especially alone at night, so I decided to go for a walk down the rural country road. It was probably around midnight. I had walked several hundred yards down the paved road and cut across the corner of someone's cow pasture to get to a dirt road. I had gone through an electric fence and had made it about 50 yards through the pasture when I heard something moving in the adjacent cornfield on the opposite side of the dirt road from the pasture. I stopped and listened and heard the sound of something big moving quickly through the corn rows. At first, I thought it might be a deer, until I realized that the steps and movements sounded bipedal and large. Several times it moved and then paused, then moved through the corn quickly again. After hearing the movement several times, suddenly the sound of movement was followed by the sound of a rabbit squealing. I instinctively crouched, peering into the darkness. Up until this moment, I had only been curious as to what kind of animal I had gotten close to. I had no way of fathoming what was about to step out. I saw a large bipedal figure walk out of the cornfield. It crossed the dirt road and stepped over the electric fence mid-stride without pause or effort. In the bright light of the moon and stars, I could make out some details. Its head had significant wolf-like features, a long snout and pointed ears. It was taller than a human, maybe 7 feet, possibly a little more, and it walked leaning forward with its shoulders hunched forward like it was slightly crouched. It was covered in hair, but the hair seemed thinner or shorter on much of its torso and arms. I remember noticing it had a very lean, powerful, muscular build. Its arms seemed unusually long and hung low as it moved, and it clutched something in one of what appeared to be long hands. I couldn't make out its color because of the limited light. It just appeared dark-colored. I never noticed a tail or whether it had the double knees these creatures are often portrayed as having. Despite being a semi-bright night, a lot of its body from the waist down was obscured in shadow. It crouched on the ground, clutching the rabbit in both hands, and I started hearing wet and crunching noises, and realized that it was eating the rabbit. It was squatting low on the ground, holding it with both of its hands, eating it like you might eat a fried chicken drumstick and thigh with 2 hands. At this point, I guess it couldn't have been more than 40 yards from me. It's hard to remember details you didn't think about at the time many years later. I had on a camouflage jacket and jeans, and I remember trying to make myself small while crouching and hoping it wouldn't notice me. When it paused and sniffed as if smelling something, then it raised its head up and sniffed the air. It was at that moment that I thought, crap, I hope it isn't smelling my scent. At that moment, it looked directly at me and emitted this low guttural growl, and I swear its eyes flashed red, something that I've never seen an animal do without a light reflecting in them. It was less bright than when a light reflects directly in an animal's eyes, but distinct enough I could see the red eyes briefly flicker in the darkness. This didn't appear to be reflected light, it appeared to come from the creature for a split second, and then disappeared. Bizarre, I know. Looking directly at me, the creature stood up like it was challenging me, and growled this low guttural growl that I heard from the 40 yards away. At that moment, I felt fear overwhelm me. I had this overwhelming urge to haul ass back to my house, but something inside, something told me not to run, that if I did, it would catch me and kill me. When I previously told about all of the times I felt hunted, and I felt a sense of unnatural terror, like my life was about to be forfeit in the most sudden, violent way, well, now it was like I was looking at the source eye to eye. Somehow I knew that this creature was a bad, wicked thing, far more powerful than me, and something like an inaudible voice kept telling me if I ran, my life was forfeit. Walk, don't run, pray, stay calm. These thoughts kept going through my head, but they weren't coming from my conscious mind. I slowly backed out of the field, never turning my back to the creature until briefly when I had to cross the electric fence. Even then, I tried to not turn my back completely to it and keep one eye on it. At this point, it had moved deeper into the shadows of the pasture and was moving parallel to the direction I was going. I would occasionally hear it moving through the field, still staying parallel to me as I had begun to walk down the paved road towards my home. As I moved down the black top, I came to a section of woods with no houses or lights nearby. I had to walk through at least a few hundred yards of wooded road to get back to my house, and there was only one house on the way. No lights anywhere, and nothing but woods. The thing tracked alongside me the whole way, moving through the woods in the darkness with absolute ease. Occasionally, I would hear a branch crack or the swish of vegetation, and a few times it stopped to growl that low guttural growl at me. It's odd how I could hear it growl. I don't think I would have heard a dog growling at that distance. The entire time I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, fear, and imminent, inescapable death. I continued to listen to the internal voice and prayed hard the whole way. It kept telling me to walk, not to run, and to pray. I prayed. Oh, did I pray? I don't know if it was the voice or my intuition, but I somehow knew with absolute certainty that if I ran, it would kill me. There was something symbolic about the act of fleeing from this evil, and I knew if I did, everything was over. As I walked through the dark, wooded stretch of road, I remember wondering if any of my remains would be found, and if so, what they would claim did it. I kept feeling like I was going to be killed at any moment. Time seemed to drag on. It seemed like forever until I got close to my house. I finally reached my driveway and even walked backwards up a hill to my house because I didn't want to turn my back to it. Sure enough, it was across the road from my house, growling from the edge of the tree line and bushes. I finally bolted when I got about 10 yards from my door. I ran through the house, locking doors, and grabbed my old shotgun, even though I felt certain that the small game loads I had in it wouldn't do anything but piss the thing off. I was too afraid to look out the windows as I knew it was outside, and feared seeing it looking back at me through the windows. The feeling this thing gave me was not just a dangerous one. It was an evil feeling, like this was a wicked, unnatural thing. I sat in my room and prayed, if memory serves, until dawn broke. A few weeks or months later, sorry I can't remember the specifics, my little sister came downstairs sometime around or after 1 a.m., white as a ghost and panic-stricken. She was terrified. You could see it all over her. When I asked my family what was wrong, they told me she had seen a bear crouching outside of her window. She had woken up to a terrifying feeling, knew something was watching her sleep, and when she looked at the window next to her bed, she saw a bear with big red eyes staring at her. My sister slept in a bedroom on the second floor, but the garage adjoining that part of the house was one story. Something had climbed up on the roof of the garage and had been intently watching her through the window. I asked her point blank if she was sure it was a bear. I could tell she was terrified and didn't want to acknowledge something. She responded with, It was covered in hair, had big red eyes, and was staring at me sleeping through the window. I was asleep when I woke up with a feeling of terror. I knew something was watching me. It felt like it was bad. I'm paraphrasing, as this was many years ago. I was generally too afraid to go back in the woods around my house after that, but when I did summon up the courage, I would periodically have to abruptly stop hikes in the woods near the house. Everything would be fine, and then I would suddenly become overwhelmed with the ominous feeling that I was living on borrowed time, that the creature was stalking me, and that it was about to kill me. I almost always left immediately, feeling like the shotgun in my hands that I carried was useless. On multiple occasions when this happened, I felt the inner voice again, telling me to leave now, walk, don't run, and to pray. On the couple of occasions that I lingered momentarily to scan the woods for the creature, I never saw anything, but it felt like it grew closer, and the danger grew more imminent, so I always left. It was around this time that I found someone's white domestic rabbit, hanging from a tree branch in the woods, disemboweled, and with its eyes plucked out. It was hanging from a branch about 5 feet off the ground. It struck me that it was like it was meant to be seen, as it was placed in a highly visible location, right behind someone's property line at eye level, at the edge of a field beside the woods where this thing seemed to frequent. It just seemed significant. It was about that time that I learned that Native Americans lived on the nearby adjacent property who were said to use blood magic. I'm part Native American too, and I was told to stay away from them. We lived near a reservation, and multiple people had told me about someone who was a known shapeshifter, someone who had purportedly demonstrated their ability to shift into animals, and they had ties to this family. The few times someone told me something like that, they always acted like it was a taboo thing that they should not be speaking of. I don't know if it's relevant, but it feels like it all might be connected. A couple of years later, a friend of mine came to pick me up to take me to a nearby city. We pulled out of my driveway after midnight, and right down the road from my house, we saw a pair of huge wolves standing a few feet from the road, calmly watching us, even staring at the car from a few feet away as we passed. Their presence and behavior seemed and felt very unnatural, and my friend who had grown up there freaked out. He became pale, sweaty, and started stuttering, telling me, "Those are wolves. Those are huge. The only wolves in Florida are a few red wolves which almost look like big coyotes. They have reddish-brown coloring and are very small for a wolf. These individuals were silver, gray, and black, and I guess they looked to weigh about 140 to 180 pounds. One was smaller than the other, and when I looked at them, I instinctively knew they were a pair. One male, one female. The red wolves aren't present anywhere near that part of the Florida Panhandle, and this was something entirely different. I questioned my uncle, a state biologist and a huge outdoorsman, and he told me there were very few red wolves in Florida. They were nowhere near that size, and there were none anywhere near me. Similarly, there weren't any red-eyed, roof-sitting, window-peering bears in the area, as all the bears in the area had been hunted out many years ago. I don't know what the true nature of what I experienced was, but it always left me with the sense that it had a very strong supernatural element. Yes, these things had physical forms, but there was something more, something supernatural. My friend knew something, but he was so terrified that all he would tell me is that there were natives in the area, and that part of the woods was special to them, and then he would get an even more terrified look. Clam up and change the subject. He used to have a house in that immediate area, and he said, strange things happened. There was something bad around the house, something in those woods. He said that their house mysteriously burnt down one day when no one was home. They had it rebuilt, and it caught on fire and burned down a second time when no one was home. Whatever happened spooked him was so scary that they bought a new home many miles away, and he was spooked to even think about it. When locals told me of natives who were purportedly shifters, I began researching and learned that many tribes had beliefs of dark magic that would allow them to transform, much like the skinwalkers. These rituals are always dark rituals that involve blood, sacrifice, or some other dark or evil deeds. After that, I just stayed completely out of the woods around the house, and I didn't walk further than the barn behind the house at night. There were still several incidents, more loud, piercing screams in the night. Once or twice, I heard a baby crying out in the woods during the middle of the night. As I thought to myself, that's no baby, something is trying to lure me out there or screw with me. The sound changed from the very distinctive sound of a baby into something wicked and unnatural, almost like an evil, twisted mockery of the sound of a baby crying. I felt that it was literally trying to mess with me, trying to instill terror and let me know that it was there. One time I had to talk my brother and a friend out of going into the woods to look for the baby. And again, as soon as everyone agreed that there couldn't possibly be a baby crying that loudly in the woods in the middle of the night, the sound changed into something wicked which would curdle your blood. There was also another occasion where we heard puppies crying out from a ditch in the edge of the woods in the middle of the night. Once again, a couple of friends wanted to rush out there to rescue the puppies, and once again, as soon as I pointed out that it couldn't possibly be puppies out there in the woods in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, the sound changed, and it was always a wicked, terrifying sound, almost like some evil thing was trying to create the most disturbing sounds it could. Shortly after this, I moved away and rarely visited that home, and all of my encounters of this nature ended when I left.
Coming up, a woman sees something peering into her bedroom window late one night at her grandparents' farmhouse.
I used to stay at my grandparents' house a lot when I was younger. They wanted to help my mom out. They owned a 40 to 50 acre farm with their house about a quarter mile into the woods. It was summer and we all were going to bed. I always have had trouble falling asleep and was the only one awake, and was returning from the bathroom to join my cousin on the top bunk with me in the bottom. The bedroom had one window facing a light post my grandparents had installed. I was just covering myself up when I saw something cast a shadow against the window curtain. Once, then twice. It was fast, but I could tell there was something moving outside. I crawl out of the bed, hugging the floor, already scared. I was about a foot from the closed curtain with my eye just above the windowsill. I stared out and nothing happened for a few seconds. Then I saw a figure cast a shadow onto the curtain. It looked like a huge dog head. It had a long snout and pointed ears. It stopped perfectly center of the window frame, then slowly turned its head to face me. I froze, but it then raised up a few inches to show its shoulders. I can only describe it as a wolf head on a human body. Then it turned away and moved on. People said I was young and it was only a nightmare, but it wasn't. I remember it too vividly. I forgot to mention that this window was about 5 feet up from the ground. It was my mother's old room as a child, and when I asked her if she ever saw anything, she paused for several seconds, began to speak, shook her head, and stuttered out a no. She also refused to mention them aloud. She knew the folklore and refused to speak of them, and we dropped it, but I knew why she responded that way. I can't explain this, I'm still scared to be alone at night there.
Next, at 30, alone in the woods, a man was attacked by an unseen force, a growling, paralyzing creature that left no trace but scared him for life.
My life at age 30 by myself in the woods. I was scouting an area that was in Delaware County, which is in the suburbs of Philly, looking for the perfect spot to spend my summer. After my long journey, testing different areas out, having bad experiences such as my tent flooding after heavy rains, I found a huge hill that probably went up for a few thousand feet. This certain hill was on a giant rock outcropping with many beautiful stones, such as garnets embedded in the host rock. I honestly thought I found the perfect camp, secluded from everyone and everything, surrounded by a large creek. The area was well planted with huge trees of all kinds. Due to all these factors being perfect for what I was looking for, I set my tent up right on top of the hill. The tent that I owned was a one-person tent, literally just big enough for me to sleep in, which is all I really needed. I'm pretty much set. All I had left to do was create a barrier with local tree branches so I could keep out anyone and hide my tent. Upon stringing up a huge wall of branches in the area and putting trip lines around my campsite, you can never be too safe, I began living my life. Many days passed that summer before the incident that changed my life forever. So before I delve into this experience, I want to add that it would be nearly impossible for any dog or anyone to get up this hill. Someone would have to be extremely dedicated in finding this place to get to it. During my adventure living alone in the wilderness, my brother would occasionally meet me a bit away to drop off supplies such as beer, food, water, the basics. On a beautiful summer night, after it just rained very heavily, I was laying up on the hill right outside my tent. I was immersed in extremely dense fog. The whole area looked as if it was covered in a huge cloud. I was tired from a long walk earlier, so eventually, when it hit around 10 p.m., I retired to my tent. I crawled in and lay down with all my equipment around me. It was extremely cramped in there. I zipped up the door flap and began relaxing. I started reading a good book I had when I noticed it was getting really late. So I got my flashlight out, put on my headlamp, and just chilled. Periodically, I would text my sister to let her know that I was okay, and just catch up on things. It hit around 1:00 a.m. when I started having a very strange feeling. A feeling something is wrong. I tried to shrug it off, but it wouldn't go away. I lay there with my headlamp on, fully illuminated. My tent had a tiny opening at the top with mesh so you can see out of it. Other than that, you can't really see anything on the outside. As I was reading, I suddenly heard something run very loudly towards my tent right on my left-hand side. It stopped right next to me and began loudly barking, almost as if a dog was right in your face about to attack. I suddenly shuddered with fear, saying to myself, that can't be a dog. There's no possible way anything can get to my tent with my barricade and my trip lines, or at least not without making an extreme struggle and lots of noise. So, in complete fear, hearing this beast growl and bark like a maniac, I fumbled to get my phone in a panic. I started texting my sister saying, "Listen, there's something outside my tent and it's pretty pissed off." She texted me back, saying, "Maybe it's a dog." I'm like, "A dog could not get up this hill. It's impossible." The thing stopped harassing me and eventually disappeared after about 10 minutes. I was very frightened after I heard what I heard, so I dialed 911 in my phone, ready to make the call, and held on to it in case that thing came back. After an hour passed and nothing happened, I began to relax a little. I kicked off my shoes, cracked open a beer, and resumed reading. Let me just say I've been in the woods for 6 months straight before and never had anything like this happen. It was so chilling that I get sick thinking about it. As I'm laying there, time started to pass with no sign of the creature. I was too horrified to even look out the tent at this point. Plus, the ground was covered in fog. 3 o'clock rolled around. I firmly held the phone in my right hand just in case. Suddenly, I was completely paralyzed. I lay there in a state of fear so intense that I thought I was going to die. Then something grabbed me, tent, sleeping bag and all. Whatever grabbed me began picking me up and smashing me into the ground. This thing was so strong that I felt like a rag doll. It just kept squeezing me and shaking me as if I was nothing. I looked at my phone in my hand, desperately trying to move my thumb to hit the dial button, but it was impossible. This thing was breathing so loud and making noises so sinister that the impression I got was that this thing crawled right out from hell and wanted to take me out of my tent. It beat the living hell out of me. I pictured myself being carried away by this horrible thing into a cave to be eaten. After fighting for probably 7 minutes while being completely paralyzed, it suddenly stopped. The state of fear I was in was so intense that the moment I was free, my thumb immediately hit 911. I got a girl dispatcher on the line. I thought to myself, what do I say? I'm in the middle of nowhere and I was attacked by something. No one is going to take this seriously. I hung the phone up and started texting my sister saying, "Listen, here is my location. I was just attacked by something." I got no answer. I kept texting, no answer. I cowered in my tent for the next few hours till the sun came up. I was so worn out from the beatdown that I crawled out of my tent in extreme pain. After a complete search of the area for footprints or a sign something had been there, I came up empty. No lines were tripped, no branches were moved, and my tent wasn't damaged. It doesn't make much sense because I'm damaged. I could barely walk. Eventually, I moved my campsite and got a bigger tent. I still don't know what it was that attacked me. I don't know what that thing was, menacingly barking and growling outside my tent. I'm literally scarred to this day. This all really happened. Was it the Dogman? I mean, it did bark and growl. Was it a Bigfoot? Do they bark and growl too? I don't know, but it could have killed me very easily if it wanted to. It could have made me a missing person in a heartbeat. I don't know why I survived or how. I have a feeling that this thing was pissed at me for tearing down giant tree branches to fortify my camp, but I'm not exactly sure. So to anyone out there, if you're camping, don't harm any type of tree or plant. It might trigger these things to attack.
No idea what that could have been, but Dogman sounds about right. I have heard stories of Bigfoot picking up campers while they're sleeping, still in their sleeping bags, and carrying them off into the wilderness. Oh man, who really knows what this was, but it's a wild story nonetheless. Up next, a family's move to rural Wisconsin turns terrifying after eerie howls, glowing red eyes, and a mysterious figure drive them to flee their new home.
This took place roughly 14 years ago. When I was a kid, my family moved out of the city and moved to a small town called Deer Brook, situated on the outskirts of Antigo, Wisconsin. Our house was surrounded by woods on 3 sides and a river and field in the back. The first year out there was really calm and relaxing, other than constant coyote howls every night, but every so often there would be a different howl. It was a deeper, much louder howl that would shake us to our core. At first, my parents would dismiss it as a wolf or just a bigger coyote, but something about it seemed off. One night in mid-July, my brother, my sister, and I decided to pitch a tent in the backfield along the tree line. We just wanted to go camping. We sat with sticks roasting our marshmallows till it got really dark. Then the typical howls started up. But once again, that deep howl was back, and it sounded like it was right in our ears, completely surrounding us. With how loud it was, it's hard to even guess where it was coming from. So we decided to put out our fire and get in the tent. Later that night, my sister fell asleep, so my brother and I chatted and made jokes. Within minutes, we heard animals running around outside the tent, and then this little raccoon started to claw at the side of the tent that I was sleeping on. At first, I kept just poking at it, but then we heard something else, the crack of sticks from the trees. At that point, my brother thought it was a bear and told us to be quiet and woke my sister up. We started to hear footsteps coming closer and closer. Pretty quickly, they were right next to me. The raccoon just bolted out of there, and then there started to be this strange odor coming from somewhere. It smelled like copper, sulfur, and wet dog. It was almost overpowering and made me want to puke. Then we heard our mom calling us, and as she shined the flashlight on us, it revealed the most unsettling thing I have ever seen. The shadow of this thing was shining through our tent, and it was massive. It had pointed ears that were tilted back like a dog on the prowl, and its hands were human-looking with long fingers. The mouth was in the shape of a snout, just a little shorter, and it had a mid-sized tail. My mom started screaming, and whatever that thing was bolted back into the woods. We rushed inside with our mom and didn't go back out for a few days. Fast forward a few months, I was in the living room with my mom while my sister was in the shower. We were watching Wheel of Fortune or something like that, when my sister screamed bloody murder. My mom jumped up and went to get her. She pulled her out of the bathroom, and I got curious as to why she was freaking out, so I went in to see. Above the shower is one of those super small windows that only a small head could fit through, and in the window was a set of red glowing eyes staring down at me. We stared at each other for what felt like a decade. I didn't feel fear, more just curiosity, and I didn't feel like I was in danger at that time. As my mom came in to pull me out, the eyes turned away as well. The rest of the night was quiet after that. A few days later, my brother came back from his dad's. He and I had bunk beds, so I'd always take the bottom bunk. That night was kind of a gloomy night. It wasn't real windy, but it was drizzling a little bit. Later in the night, my brother and I got woken up to the window being opened. It was locked beforehand, by the way. After that, we just closed it and went back to bed.
It happened again and again, like 3 more times. Each time we locked it, but the final time was the worst. It flung open so hard that the glass shattered. Then we saw what pushed it open. That same hand from the tent, but I could see it clearly now. It had matted black fur, or hair rather, covering its whole arm. The skin on its palms was like a light tan, and the claws were about 5 to 6 inches long. On the bottom of the window, I saw its face, or what was showing. It was just the eyes glowing bright red. They looked like the embers of a roaring fire. My brother and I bolted up, grabbed my sister, and locked ourselves in the back gaming room. We stayed there for the rest of the night, and when my mom came home, we told her and packed our things. We moved out of that house in a day and took what we could fit. My stepdad's truck was full as well, and we left, never to return. To this day, my family is scared to talk about it.
I have to be honest, after hearing stories like this, I often fantasize about moving back to Wisconsin and going in search of Dogman as like a full-time job. As terrifying as this cryptid is specifically, and knowing a lot of people in Wisconsin and having spent a lot of time there and high school there, I think it'd be a really fun adventure. Next, in 2013, a couple in Michigan's Upper Peninsula encounter a towering wolf-like creature on 2 legs outside of their cabin.
My Dogman encounter happened on season opener in November of 2013 in the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan, on my family hunting property near a town called Cedarville. The house my husband and I were staying in up there had a big front yard, but other than that cleared area and the gravel driveway, everything else is pretty deep hardwood forest. I also want to state ahead of time that this happened at around 11 p.m., so everything that's beyond the porch lights was pretty hard to see. My husband and I had gone outside to have a cigarette, and we took our rifle out with us whenever we were hanging around outside because there's bear and stuff back there in that area. I was up on the porch still, and my husband had gone down the steps into the yard and was facing towards me when we heard these really heavy, slow footsteps coming up the driveway through the woods. It sounded like a really big man, but there was this weird heavy breathing too, and the footsteps, even though they sounded like a person, sounded heavier than anything I had ever heard walking in the woods, including full-sized adult bear. My husband looked at me and mouthed, "What the fuck?" I was trying to figure out what it was that I was hearing, but nothing I had ever heard out there in those woods in my whole life matched the size, breathing, and gait of whatever this was, so I was confused and shaking my head. My husband isn't a hunter and grew up in the city, so he was completely confused too. I've hunted and tracked basically everything that's indigenous to northern Michigan since I was small, so I was honestly terrified that this animal was a complete unknown to me by sound. It walked out of the tree line at the edge of the yard behind my husband, and it was a lot taller than him, at least 7 foot tall or more, and I'd estimate the weight for its size at around 400 pounds. It was on 2 legs and had super dark black fur that was somehow even darker than the nighttime dark of the woods. It was walking back and forth at that distance from us the whole time this encounter happened, but it would not step into where the perimeter of the porch light was. I had a really hard time making out its torso for that reason, but I saw a wolf-like head and snout with pointed ears that stuck straight up. Instead of front legs and paws, it had really disproportionately long arms and hands. It was on 2 legs this whole time, walking back and forth. I freaked out and grabbed the rifle and just started shooting at it, yelling at my husband to run and get up on the porch. My husband did, and then he took the gun from me and told me to find something to use as a weapon and to go inside and hide. So I did. I got a big knife and went and locked myself in our bedroom in the closet and could hear my husband shooting and reloading a bunch for about another 10 minutes. He came in and told me through the closet door that the Dogman had finally run off, but he wasn't sure if it was going to possibly come back, so we were both pretty terrified. I ended up staying in that closet all night until sunrise with my husband guarding the door with the gun. He told me that he thought I had hit it when I was shooting at first, but the next day we didn't find any blood or hair or anything, which I thought was weird because I really thought I must have shot and wounded it a couple of times. It moved incredibly fast, though, and was agile enough to run through the brush and stuff without really mowing it down or making a bunch of noise like big animals usually do running through dense underbrush. The whole encounter was incredibly weird and scary. My husband also said that he did see it sort of hunch over and drop down onto all fours a few times while it was running back and forth at the edge of the yard. When it ran away for good that night, it was running insanely fast and on two legs like a man. We didn't smell anything bad like a lot of people describe when they see these things, and it didn't even leave any noticeable tracks anywhere. Even though the thing was so heavy when it was walking up the gravel driveway that I swore the ground near it must have been shaking. We found out later from one of the neighbors that he had seen it too next door the winter before when it came up on the porch of his cabin and looked in the door window during a party he and his wife had been throwing. He said he heard really heavy footsteps on the porch and pulled back the curtain on the window, and the Dogman was standing there on the other side of the glass looking down at him. Its fur was white then, probably because there was snow on the ground at this point in the year. My neighbor hollered at everyone in the cabin and told them what he had just seen. Everyone decided to make a run for it through the woods to his mom's house next door, since her place was a lot sturdier than the hunting cabin. I've known that neighbor my whole life practically since high school, and he would never make something like that up. He was scared even while he was just talking about it. I also read somewhere online recently that another family about 45 miles north of our area had a bunch of livestock like cows and horses turn up dead and torn up by some kind of big predator. One of the guys in the family saw a giant upright wolf back near his hunting blind during deer season, which freaked me out since we had our experience on season opener. The land butting up to that family's property is hundreds of miles of the Hiawatha National Forest, so it would make sense to me that a big animal would hide in and near a protected area like that when it's hearing gunshots everywhere else. My lot and my neighbor's lot also are right alongside state land. My husband and I moved since this all happened, but the experience was so upsetting to me that I constantly research online to see if anyone else has seen this thing up north and what their encounter was like. I've even heard that there's a small pack of about 4 or 5 of them that live in state forest downstate in Isabella County that a bunch of locals in the nearby area have seen. Somebody even saw one at night in downtown Saginaw, Michigan. What scares me about that is the fact that there's no tree cover there, as that's a city. I wonder if people all over the state are seeing these animals because they're getting forced out of their usual hunting territories due to hunting, logging, and mining that's really increased over the years here. Be careful out there.
Coming up, in 1970s Provo, Utah, horrifying howls startled 3 teens and later returned to terrify 1 teen from the shadows one night.
I had a couple of experiences in the 1970s. I was newly moved to what was then a fairly wooded area of Provo, Utah, on the northwest side. My mom and I lived on a main artery of town with woods going down to the Provo River. A couple of my girlfriends from high school had spent a Saturday night at my house. That Sunday morning, we walked down to the fields and apple orchards in back of our house, which went back several acres. We had just gone between 2 old outbuildings and were about to open the gate to go into the orchard over the irrigation creek. All 3 of us heard an extremely loud growl and howl come from the building to our right. It didn't sound like a dog or have that wild, crazy cry of a coyote. It sounded to all 3 of us exactly like the howling of a wolf. We looked at each other and split, running for the house. We were the only ones home. We locked the doors, pulled down the shades, and huddled in the living room trying to figure out what we had heard. All 3 of us were experienced campers, and we had heard all sorts of animals on these trips. Many of the camping trips had been the 3 of us together. This sounded weird, sort of extremely loud but yet muffled, like listening to kids talking into the old string and can phones. Tape recorders were cassette or reel-to-reel at that time. There was no way someone was hiding in that building playing a tape recorder. There was no electricity to those buildings either at the time. They were boarded up and padlocked. There were no loose boards or holes that something like a big dog or even a cat could get in through. You would have needed to have an amplifier or speaker cranked up to get that sort of volume. My mom found us sitting in the front room in the dark, and we were really hesitant to tell her what we had heard for obvious reasons. She sort of blew it off. We never did find out anything about it. The adults we asked about it said it was our imagination. To this day, the 3 of us still talk about that incident. The second incident happened in 1977. I was in college then, and now living in a massive apartment complex in the southwest part of Provo. My mom and I had gone to bed around 9. We were both awakened at 1 a.m. to growling, whining, and that same loud, freaking howling right outside the sliding glass door in my bedroom. We could hear something large out there. It let out this blood-curdling howl almost exactly like what my friends and I had heard a few years earlier. My mom wanted to look out the window. I had 2 small adult dogs at the time, and they had dove under the bed, silent, and wouldn't come out for hours. I told her not to look out the window. I didn't want to see this thing, but more to the point, I didn't want it to see us. We could hear it whining and growling, running off through the parking lot, eventually fading away. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I knocked on our neighbor's door and asked if they had heard a dog howling in our adjoining backyard. He said no, he'd slept peacefully. It was hard for me to believe he hadn't heard it because it had been so loud and weird. I told my mom what he had told me, and she couldn't believe anyone could have slept through that. We stayed up the next night and waited. We couldn't sleep. I had since tacked down my drapes so whatever it was couldn't peek in. We drank coffee in the front room in the dark and watched the clock. Right at 1 a.m., it started. Again, the dogs froze and suddenly darted noiselessly under the table and shook. This time, the whining of whatever it was almost sounded like a baby crying. There was growling, and then it began to howl. And midway through the howl, it stopped suddenly, like something had startled it. We heard a rustle and loud thumping running. Again, we heard the weird baby cry and whine fade off through the grass going west. We never heard it again after that. I guess I am talking about this experience to see if anyone has any more information as to what it was or has experienced it themselves in the Provo area.
For our final story of the evening, while exploring an abandoned hospital, a teen encounters a terrifying dogman escaping with a haunting lesson: we're not alone.
I live in southern Ohio near the Ohio River. Myself and a few friends decided to go explore the abandoned hospital that backed up to a giant hill and large forest across the river in Maysville, Kentucky. It was a local spot for dumb teenagers to go and scare each other and play grab-ass with their girlfriends. Running into other people wasn't uncommon, but you could usually tell if others were there because there would be cars parked near it. That being said, on this night, we were the only dumb teenagers there. The moment we got out of the car, everything felt wrong. We knew we weren't allowed to be there because the building was condemned, but this felt like we were actually in danger. Of course, we always were because it was condemned, but it just felt different. By this point, I had been to Hazelwood Hospital 20 times or so, and was familiar with the layout. Once the 3 of us had gotten inside, we had been there about 45 minutes when we split up to tag some different places and explore. I went to take pictures of the morgue in the basement to see if I could photograph any orbs or anything really cool. I had been in the morgue for about 10 minutes when I smelled the most foul smell I've ever smelled. It was rot. I don't know what was rotting. I imagine it was a large dog or a coyote, but all I could make out was about 40 pounds of rotting meat. I had just started to look at the meat chunk when I heard the slam of a steel door and what sounded like running through puddles of water. This meant whatever it was in the basement with me because the floor had about 3 inches of standing water in it. Naturally, I figured it was my shitty friends playing a prank on me. That was when I decided to get them back and scare them before they could scare me. The way the morgue was set up, you could climb on top of the coolers they used to store the bodies. I hopped up there and laid in wait to scare the shit out of my friends. I had been there no more than a minute when I heard screaming. I've known my friends my entire life, at this point 19 years, and I've never heard screaming like this. The screaming stopped and I heard hard footsteps running above me, and what I can best describe as pounding. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't freaking out a little because this wasn't like my friends. It was usually hide behind a corner and jump out and go, "Gotcha!" This was different. This was dread I was starting to feel. As I continued to lay there, about 5 minutes passed when I heard panting and footsteps in the water. They were getting closer. That was when I smelled wet dog. But it wasn't just wet dog I was smelling. I was smelling that same smell of rot, too. Then another steel door slammed, and I could tell it was the same door I passed before I got to the morgue's door. The panting was even louder now, and honestly, it sounded more like labored breathing and sniffing. At this point, I was terrified. I tried to slowly back away from the edge of the cooler so I could slip behind the wall it backed up to and drop into the boiler room. I was almost to the end of the cooler when I heard the morgue door slam open and break the tiles on the wall with the door handle. I was less than 35 feet from whatever was panting and smelling like death. All I could think was, run, just run. I could hear the sniffing, and then I heard the deepest, most menacing growl I've ever heard. Movies and shows don't do justice to just how deep and rough a growl of this size sounds. It was sniffing me out. It was actually smelling where I had been. I dropped down behind the wall into the boiler room and thanked God the door that connected the morgue to it was blocked with old gurneys and a locker on its side. I thought this would stop the thing from getting in. I was wrong. So very wrong. I hadn't been in the boiler room 30 seconds before I heard pounding and scratching on the steel door. It sounded like Freddy Krueger was trying to carve his way through the steel door. Then I heard the sound that still haunts me to this day. It howled. A bellow so loud I had to cover my ears. On the other side of the boiler room was access to the generator and the dock doors for trucks and the hillside leading to the woods. When I reached the other side of the room, I could hear this thing slamming into the door, knocking the lockers and gurneys away. I opened the door to the dock room, and when I looked back, I saw the arm of this creature sticking through the opening it had made. It was like a horror movie. It was a gray and brown mass of fur, but it looked like a human arm, except the hand was all wrong. The hand had 5 digits, but the claws would have made a bear run in fear. I slammed the door behind me and ran for the dock doors. The dock doors wouldn't budge. I could hear the gurneys overturning and the lockers sliding on the floor. It was getting through, and the only thing between me and it now was a single door. I ran to one of the windows by the dock doors and proceeded to bust it out, mangling my hand from the glass. As I was pulling myself through the window, I heard the door get slammed into, and one of the hinges flew off. I tumbled out of the window and hit the cold, wet ground. When I stood up, I saw it in the doorway. I'm 6'4", 250 pounds, not little by any means. And this thing took up the entire doorway, an 8-foot-tall, 3-foot-wide door. It was covered head to toe in gray-brown fur. It had a very narrow snout, almost like a Doberman pinscher. Its ears were barely visible because of the doorway, but I could tell they were pointing up like a dog's. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was completely paralyzed. This thing was staring right into my soul, looking at every delicious part it was going to enjoy. I've never felt like an item on a menu, but I can tell you it's terrifying. Then it snarled, and that woke me from my disbelief, and I turned and ran. I ran up the hill into the woods to get around the hospital and back to the street where the car was parked. I hadn't made it 25 feet when I heard it clawing to get out the window. I knew I wouldn't make it to the car this way, so I ran back toward the hospital where the fire escape ladder was. I had used the ladder before to climb to the roof and take pictures of the entire town. I completely skipped the first 3 rungs on the ladder and was now inside the enclosed part of the fire escape. Again, this thing howled, and I could feel waves of pure terror filling my body. My hand was killing me, and I was getting blood on everything. Just as I reached the first floor window I could climb into, this thing slammed into the fire escape ladder, knocking me down a couple of rungs. It leaped onto the outside of the fire escape and began clawing at my feet. Just as I reached the window, I felt it. Pain like nothing I've ever felt. It had grabbed just above my ankle and yanked, shredding my boot, the end of my jeans, and my flesh. I was able to pull myself into the first floor window. I heard it push itself off the fire escape and head back the way it came. At this point, I was dragging my left leg and trying to keep my right hand in my hoodie pocket. The entrance we came in from was only about 150 feet away, down the main hall and around a left turn. Halfway down the hall, I heard the steel doors slamming again. I was dragging myself down the hall, trying to stay focused on getting out of this hellhole. Then the howling started again, and I could hear it getting closer. I made the turn and heard the pounding coming up the stairs from the basement. I made it to the entrance and heard the patting of hands and feet on the floor. I made the mistake of looking back just as it rounded the corner, running on all fours like a real dog. I bolted down the hill toward the street where the car was parked and realized the car was gone. They left me. My only way of escape was gone. I just zoned out and kept running down the hill. My leg was throbbing, my hand was in agony, and all I could think was, I'm gonna be fucking dog kibble. Finally, I made it to the first house I could find and ran full force into the door, pounding on it like a crazy person. Thank God this little old lady was home. She opened the door and I literally fell inside. Just before I kicked the door closed, standing on two legs at the end of her driveway was this monster. I broke down in tears. I didn't know what to do. Luckily, the old lady had called the cops because a crazy person who was bleeding everywhere just fell into her home. When the cops got there and asked me what happened, I told them the same thing I've said here. Of course, they didn't believe me and thought I was on drugs. The EMTs took me to the hospital. When they did blood work and found no substances in my system, they concluded I was attacked by a wild dog. I ended up with 36 stitches in my leg and 17 in my hand. I had to get rabies shots and tell the local wildlife officer my story. He informed me they had reports of wild dog packs outside of town, ransacking garbage cans and killing local pets. I informed him it wasn't a pack of wild dogs, it was a giant Dogman. They all thought I was crazy. The only thing I had in my favor was the claw mark on my leg. Even the doctors were confused about how a wild dog could make a mark like that. Now you know my story and why I absolutely know we are not at the top of the food chain. I've never been back to Hazelwood Hospital and deterred anyone from ever going there. That experience has haunted me for the last 11 years of my life. It has made me into the overcautious man I am. I always have to know where every exit is when I walk into a building. I always know where large clumps of woods are. This experience changed me forever, and the way I look at the world. Just because we all haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means some people haven't been hunted for their life. I have no doubt what stalked me that night was a Dogman. I know it deep in my bones.
That is all for tonight, dear listeners, unless you are a Patreon cult member, where I've got a few more tales to keep you at the edge of your seat. If you want to become a Patreon cult member to get extended episodes and other free Patreon-only episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/campfirecultpod for only $5 a month. A quick tip for all my Apple iPhone users out there: to avoid the Apple App Store 30% fee, simply sign up from your computer's browser instead of the Patreon app, and you won't be charged the additional fee. You can still listen as you normally would, but again, only for Apple iPhone users. Sign up via your computer's browser instead of the app. Until next time, I'll be leaving you in the dark where whispers linger and shadows dance. Stay wary, sleep well, and beware the Dogman in the night. If you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can follow us anywhere on social media at Campfire Cult Pod and online at campfirecultpod.com. And finally, if you don't mind, please rate and review wherever possible.